Welcome to Healthfully Rooted Home. This is Kiri, and today I'm giving you some tips on how to be a better home cook. So, funny story, when I first got married to my husband, he didn't think that I was a good cook. He actually thought he was the better cook in the relationship. And you know what? He was right. I knew nothing about cooking. And he had tasted by cooking many times throughout our dating experience. So he had something to base this assumption off of. So what happened? Well, I learned how to be a good cook. And these are all the tips for how I did it. My first tip, and this will be a common thread throughout all of these tips, is to actually care. Look up how to cook. If you're planning on cooking shrimp tonight, look up how to cook the best shrimp, or how to roast the perfect chicken, or how to make tender cuts of meat, or how to roast vegetables. Learn knife skills, research the proper methods for doing all these things in the kitchen, and you'll actually learn a lot. For example, I used to majorly overcook shrimp, and I just thought we weren't a shrimp family until one day I really wanted to cook this prawn recipe. I had had it at a restaurant and I was like, okay, I really need to make this at home and I need to learn how to do it well. And so I looked it up. I researched how to cook perfect shrimp, and I realized that they should only be cooked for about 3 minutes in total on high heat. So I learned something and now I know how to cook shrimp. Another example is how to roast vegetables. If you want to make sure that they aren't mushy, then you need to pull them out as soon as you can smell them in your house. You can learn how to make cheap cuts of beef super tender by using the proper method. So be looking these things up as you're planning your meals for the week. The next tip, and this is something I am always doing, is I'm always thinking as I'm cooking a meal, how can I make this better? So look in the fridge. Are you making an Alfredo pasta and maybe you have a little leftover pesto you could throw in to give it a little more flavor, and also using up a random ingredient that you had left over? Do that. Always be thinking, how can I make this meal better? What can I add to it that would just jazz it up a little bit? Or how can I use up an ingredient I already have in the fridge that would pair well with this meal? That, quite honestly, might be my favorite tip because I use it so often and it has totally transformed my cooking. And yes, I have experimented with things that didn't end up working and didn't taste great, but most of the time it turns out amazing. I can tell you my next tip in 4 words. Write this down: salt, fat, acid, heat. So that is actually a book, and I think it's even a documentary now, but salt, fat, acid, and heat are the 4 components of a meal or of a certain food product that will make it taste good. And I'm going to quote the book Salt, Fat, Acid, and Heat to explain more deeply. So quote, there are 4 basic factors that determine how good your food will taste. Salt, which enhances flavor. Fat, which amplifies flavor and makes appealing texture possible. Acid, which brightens and balances. And heat, which ultimately determines the texture of food. End quote. So often I'll be making a meal and if I taste it and it falls flat, I'm like, oh, something's just missing. It's always because I'm missing one of these 4 components. And usually it's an acid. So I'll toss in some white wine vinegar or lemon juice and it totally brightens up the dish and will transform it. So always keep these 4 components in your head when you're cooking and when you're taste testing the meals that you're cooking. And then you can decide from there what that dish needs, whether it's salt, fat, acid, or maybe you need to cook it more or you need to change the temperature of the skillet, etc. The next tip is very basic, and that is simply to practice. Start by just following recipes. And then you can begin to branch out and make something that you've maybe followed a recipe for in the past a few times and try it without following a recipe. But you need to stay at home more so that you can do more cooking at home. Along the same lines, my next tip is to cook from scratch. This can really teach you how to cook properly because you learn the basic components of each food type and you learn how something is made. And so it really gives you a deeper understanding of how to make food in general. So learn how to make things that you would usually buy in the store. Learn how to make those from scratch at home. For example, I mentioned pesto before. So learn how to make it in your own home and you'll realize that it's really just a few ingredients. And it's also healthier when you make it at home because you can skip out on all those seed oils and sugar from the store-bought version. Okay, this is a cool tip and it's something that I've only just realized and I haven't completely thought this through. So if you think of something else to add to this list, then leave it in the comments below. But I have realized that all meals fall into about 8 basic categories. And this tip is really helpful for meal planning because you can just choose one of these categories for each day of the week and then you'll just have one category left over. Okay, so all meals fall into 8 basic categories. So the categories that I have come up with are a bowl of some sort. So a taco bowl, which is what I'm making in this video actually, or some kind of nourish bowl, something where you throw all the ingredients into a bowl and eat it like that. The second one is a sheet pan meal. Throw everything onto a sheet pan and roast it in the oven and there's your meal. The next one is a skillet meal. You take a big skillet and you throw everything into a skillet and there's your meal. The next one is a protein, vegetable, and starch meal. So that's just separated ingredients. Let's say chicken, broccoli, and rice. And then the next category is a sandwich or wrap. The next category is pizza or flatbread. The next category is a casserole. And then the last category is soups and stews. So if you, like I said, if you can think of another type of meal, then leave it in the comments below. But I can't think of any other type of meal, and that's 8 categories and makes meal planning super simple because, like I said, you can just go throughout the week and every day have a different category. So on Sundays, you make soup. On Fridays, you make pizza. On Wednesdays, you do a skillet meal, and so on. The next tip is to watch cooking channels in your free time to get ideas and learn little tricks. And ask good questions from people who are good cooks so that you can learn from them. A few of my favorite cooking channels, which I do kind of hesitate to recommend them because they have foul mouths. There's lots of cursing, but just eat the meat and spit out the bones. Pun not intended. Okay, so the channels are Pro Home Cooks, Brian Langerstrom, and Joshua Weissman. Those are all great channels. They are all really good home cooks. I think a couple of them even have chef backgrounds, but they just teach you how to be a better home cook. But I think a much better option, if you have this available to you, is to ask someone who you know who is a good cook lots of questions and observe them. And ask if you can have them over for dinner and they can teach you how to make the dish that you're making. That would be fun. It can help build community. And yeah, people who are good at something love to talk about how to do it. So I feel like they would be very flattered to do that. So just reach out to someone you know. I had someone do that to me one time and I was so impressed that they were so willing to learn. Okay, so this is a fun tip and it's to get ideas from restaurants. So I'll often get my ideas for things to make at home after a date night at a restaurant or somewhere that just has cool food. So we like to go to restaurants that aren't like the big chain restaurants, but like cute little, I don't know, there's something unique about the restaurants that we go to. And they always have the coolest food and they pair the coolest things together. And so that's what we like to do. We one time had a cheeseburger that had pepper jelly on it and cream cheese. And I tell you what, that is our favorite type of burger to make on the weekends now. And we never would have thought about that had it not been for going to that restaurant. My next tip is to go in with the right mindset. The mindset of you are serving your family and you want to give them the best. So you are going to work as hard as possible to make whatever you're making taste good for them. And that doesn't mean making an extravagant meal necessarily. It just means quite literally cooking with love. Proverbs 15:17 says, "Better is a dinner of herbs where love is than a fattened ox and hatred with it." So it's saying better is a very simple dinner of just herbs or vegetables than, a nice cut of meat that's perfectly well cooked. So go in with the right mindset. If you are going in cooking dinner with the mindset of just drudgery, or that, it's taking away from something you'd rather be doing, then you might as well just order a pizza and call it a day. Okay, so the second part of this tip of going in with the right mindset is that cooking is not inherently hard, and you need to have that mindset as you're cooking, especially if you're following a recipe. I mean, it's not like we're performing brain surgery here. So whenever I get intimidated by a recipe, I'll actually like coach myself and say, okay, Kiri, you've done way harder things before. And if it doesn't turn out, you'll learn something and it's just fine. So don't be intimidated by recipes. I used to be so intimidated by making my own bread or anything that required yeast or kneading or anything like that. And so I would look up a recipe, let's say for like cinnamon rolls or something, and I would want to make it so bad. And I would go through the instructions and I would quickly glance at them. And if I saw anything that said knead or rest or anything like that, I was like, nope, and I would leave. And now look at me, because I went in with the mindset of, no, I'm just going to push forward. I'm just going to do this, even though it seems hard. And yeah, you just really have to think like, okay, this is not that complicated. Cooking is actually not that complicated, especially if you're just following a recipe. The next tip is to not be afraid of spices and salt. So I super highly recommend building up your spice stash and actually using them. And if you're cooking a particular cut of meat, look up the best spices to use for that meat. I do this all the time. Additionally, do not be afraid of salt, especially sea salt. Just table salt is whatever, but I would use sea salt, a really good salt. And salt as you go and taste as you go, so that you know if your food is well seasoned. Another tip on salting your food is to salt the meat before you season it. So you need to let the salt rest on the meat before you even start cooking it. And it will pull out some of the moisture in the meat and flavor the meat really well. Also, back to the spices. If you don't think that you're a big fan of spices and like you just kind of have more of a simpler palate, there are spices for that too. Just simple like garlic powder and onion powder, super simple, but also will add a lot more flavor to the food. My next tip is to use the right tools for the job. There is nothing worse than trying to accomplish a task with the wrong tools. My husband says this all the time. When we first got married, he wanted to buy all these tools and I just did not understand why. I was like, are you kidding? Like, we need to spend money on this? And then I started cooking more in the kitchen and I realized I needed all these kitchen tools, which actually you don't need a lot of kitchen tools to be a good cook. But things like really good knives are really good to have. And so he pointed that out to me and I was like, oh, you know what? You're so right. Having the right tool for the job makes it so much more enjoyable and the results will be more successful. So knives are probably the most important kitchen tool that you can have, and I can link My favorite one's the one that I'm actually using right now below. They're pretty reasonable in price, but you get like the most value for your money with these specific knives. Also, learn good knife skills, and you can research this. This also will come with practice. And by the way, I'm not the best with my knife skills. They have gotten better over the years, but again, it just comes with practice, but also it comes with researching. Okay, how to cut meat, how to properly, chop garlic, or which knife to use for XYZ. So these are things that you do need to research to learn. Another tool that has totally enhanced my cooking has been learning how to cook with cast iron skillets. That has been a game changer. Seriously, I feel like our cooking is better than restaurants. So we go to a restaurant and we're usually disappointed. The next tip is to play around with different flavors like pickled foods or fermented foods, things that you wouldn't normally try. So with this dish, I have pickled red onions, and oh man, we put these things on everything, and it adds that sour flavor to something that would maybe just taste kind of bland. Fermented foods, not only are they healthy, but they also give that tang, which can really enhance an entire dish. So play around with these different cooking methods and flavors. The next tip is to make food aesthetically pleasing, or serve your food in an aesthetically pleasing way. This is just nice for your family. And what is the saying, that you eat with your eyes first? So take the extra effort to lay the food out in a way that looks nice, and your family will appreciate that. Okay, the last tip is to be willing to fail, but learn from it. So let's say something happened in the kitchen that was not ideal. Well, why did XYZ happen? For example, I just did a video and I was making a sweetbread, and the sweetbread sunk. It like totally sunk. It was actually quite hilarious. I knew why it sunk. It was because I used a loaf pan that was too small. But let's say that happens to you and you don't know why it happens, then look it up and then learn from it, and then don't do it again. But be willing to fail. If you see a recipe that looks difficult, just do it. And then if it flops, then figure out why, and then do something different next time. All right, well, there you have it. Those are all my tips on how to be a better home cook. I hope that you gleaned some insight, and I hope this blesses your family.